Hey guys, Professor Jeff here again. Today we have a little bit of a longer lecture. We're really going to go into some big topics with Descartes this week. So I'm really going to be covering four pieces of big information today. The first is the new time period that we're covering. We're moving into modern philosophy, which is an entirely different time period with some similar philosophical problems that were present in the ancients, but are going to get elaborated a little bit further. So second, we're going to talk about Descartes specifically and this tension between skepticism, faith, and Descartes' search for a first philosophy. Then we're going to talk a little bit about his cause and effect argument for the existence of God, as well as what qualifies him as a rationalist. Okay, so we have four parts to this video here. Be sure to take some notes. Let's take a look. As an introduction to this list, you guys should know that this is not a list of every single modern philosopher. There are many, many more. In fact, some people specialize just in this particular time period of philosophy and just research people of this time for their entire careers. So what we have here is really just a little representative sample that are the philosophers who fit into the time period of modern philosophy from our syllabus. So in order, we will be covering Descartes. I know it does not seem to be spelled that way, but say it with me real quick. Descartes. He was around in the 1600s, and he was a French philosopher. Next, we will be covering Locke. It was around about the same time period, a little bit later in the 1600s. He was British, and he disagreed with Descartes about many different things. We'll see as we get into it more. Next, we'll be looking at Immanuel Kant, who was around in the 1700s, okay, and he was Prussian, or what's really known today as modern-day Germany. And next, we'll be covering Mill, John Stuart Mill, who was around in the 1800s. He was British, and we'll see how these two have a very opposing approach to the idea of morality. And finally, there is Nietzsche, who is around in the 1800s. He was German, and he kind of disagreed with everybody who came before him, which makes him interesting to study as well. All right, so this is the selection of modern philosophers that we're going to be covering in this course, the time periods and their geographic locations. All right, so to now introduce a couple of terms that you really shouldn't be that unfamiliar with. We have skepticism and faith, right? So generally understood, skepticism is just the application of doubt, right? We're doubting things, we're not believing them. This is very much the method that Descartes uses to begin the meditations on first philosophy. And we can understand this as being the opposite of faith or belief. And as we continue forward in the syllabus, we'll see a couple different philosophers of different approaches to this contrast between doubt and belief. And I'm sure this is a problem that we encounter in our everyday lives, right? This doesn't just apply to whether or not God exists, but it's also, are my senses giving me reliable information? Are people trustworthy? Things of that nature. All of those questions relate to this debate between skepticism and faith. So, how does this apply to Descartes specifically? Well, we see in the first two meditations on first philosophy that Descartes begins by doubting his senses. Then he doubts the idea of a benevolent God. He says maybe God is this malevolent demon that's just there to deceive him and cause his senses to err, even though he naturally believes in the reliability of his senses. This leads him down the rabbit hole to even doubt his own existence, right? So Descartes using a method of skepticism in the meditations on first philosophy. But hold on a second. What is this first philosophy thing? So in his attempt to find something to believe, Descartes says that he just needs one idea, essentially, that is beyond doubt, that he could cling to and know is not a deception. This is what he calls his first philosophy. This is where the title of the collection comes from, Meditations on First Philosophy. Right, we're looking for this one idea that is utterly beyond doubt. And while he gets to the point here where he doubts his senses, God's benevolence, and his own existence, he comes to the conclusion, which we may have heard before, I think, therefore I am. Okay? So this quote actually comes from a different reading than the one that was assigned in class, but the same idea, the same proof is essentially there. That, let's say hypothetically, God is not a benevolent being, it's a demon who is trying to deceive us. If I am there to be deceived, I must be there, right? If I'm thinking about being deceived, if I'm being deceived, therefore I must exist. And this becomes the one idea, the first philosophy, that Descartes can begin to build a positive belief system upon. So next up here, we have Descartes' idea about cause and effect, which is really the foundation for his proof of God's existence and God's benevolence. So to begin with, and this is really a paraphrase on my part here, Descartes says there must be a greater amount of reality in the cause of something than in its effect. Okay, so before we get into this bit about the idea of God and everything, I want us to think about this because it's very interesting and it even holds up on a physical level, right? So if you look at my drawing here, you could imagine a pendulum, right? And when you bring a pendulum back to begin its swing, it essentially hits its highest point when you bring it back, right? As it swings forward, it swings to one point, and as it comes back, it doesn't quite reach the same height that it began with, right? So we require, in terms of physical movement, a greater force in the cause of something than its effect as well. So this idea isn't without its merit, but Descartes applies this specifically to the idea of God, right? So if we have this idea of God, which is this being that's perfect, eternal, the creator of everything, and even some more stuff there too, well, for him, this qualifies as proof of God's existence, because where else would we get these ideas from? There are no people or visible entities that are perfect, eternal, and the creator of everything. So if we have this idea of God, and Descartes believes this is an innate idea, meaning God implanted it in us from our birth, this counts as proof of his existence, right? So the cause of this idea must be greater than the effect, which is the idea itself, right? So that we have this idea is proof that something greater than this caused that idea in us for Descartes. Okay, make sure that makes sense. You may have to rewatch this part a couple times or email with some questions, but this is really the essential argument here that Descartes makes for God's existence. Next up, we're going to look at some quotes that should prove that Descartes is a rationalist as opposed to an empiricist. Descartes writes in the first meditation, "All that I have accepted as the highest truth I received through the senses. I observed that these sometimes mislead us, and it is the part of prudence not to place absolute confidence in that by which we have been deceived." So we see here he's casting doubt on the reliability of the senses. In the third meditation, we see Descartes writing, "Now with respect to ideas, if they are considered only in themselves and are not referred to any object beyond them, they cannot, properly speaking, be false." So here we see Descartes championing the validity of ideas over the role of the senses, a standard argument in a rationalist philosophy. Whew, that was a long one, but we did cover a lot of good information here. Just to remind you, we went over the modern philosophy section a little ahead of time here, just to see which philosophers we're going to cover, what time periods they're in, and where they're from geographically. We also went over some terms like skepticism, faith, and first philosophy, especially as they apply to Descartes. We looked a little more closely at Descartes' cause and effect argument for the existence of God, and we also examined some quotes that should prove that Descartes is a rationalist, not an empiricist. All right, so I hope you got all that, and I will see you next time.